Hey everyone, it's Tracy Martirana here from Holistic Wellness with Tracy. Thank you so much for joining me. Today, I'm inviting you into my kitchen while I make a butternut squash and kale lasagna that is super delicious. Earlier today, I prepped my butternut squash. Now, the recipe that I provide in my blog post, which you can find the link down in the description box, calls for one medium butternut squash. I had two smaller ones, so that's what I'm using. I just cut them in half, seeded them, coated them with a little olive oil, and then put them on a parchment lined baking sheet and roasted them until they were soft. They are now cooling, and I am going to move on to prepping my kale. I just have a good handful of kale and a few cloves of garlic. That's what I'm going to start with. To prep the kale, I'm just ripping the big, like woody, thick stems out. Throw those in the compost bin. And like with any green, this feels like a lot, but once you cook it up, it's not so much. It definitely shrinks a lot as the water cooks out. I'm just chopping it up roughly, mostly just because I don't want one big giant piece of kale in my lasagna that will make it difficult to eat. If you don't have kale, you can use any other green. Use spinach, Swiss chard. I don't know if you have collard greens or something like that, beet greens, those would be good too. There's just something yummy about kale, and I love the hardiness of it. I mean, it's just a nice, thick, heavy green. So I have my kale all cut. I've uncovered my garlic that was hidden underneath, and I'm going to get this started. So in a large pan, I'm using my soup pot just because it works well for everything that I have to make today. And I'm going to do several things in this. I'm going to just start with a little olive oil, and I'm going to add in my garlic. I'm doing 3 cloves here. You can do more, you can do less. I'm doing 3 here, and then I'm going to add 2 more probably to my bechamel sauce. So it'll be 5 cloves of garlic all in all. Not bad. I'm just going to move this around in the olive oil, letting it cook for maybe a minute, depending on how hot your pan gets. I just want to gently cook it without burning it. And then I'm going to add in the kale. And I know, again, it's like a whole pot full of kale. It won't last. You could use tongs if you want. I'm just trying to flip this around, getting some of the garlic and the oil to coat the leaves. And if at any point you feel like your garlic might burn, just add a little splash of water or vegetable stock to this. Just a little bit, not a lot. But if you get the oil and the garlic mixed up and up onto the kale, it's less likely to burn. I'm going to add just a little sprinkle of salt to this. I sort of feel when you're cooking things, especially like this, that are many different ingredients all layered together, You want to make sure that they're all flavored. So this has garlic and just a pinch of salt, not a lot. You can see I'm getting like a little bit of, like, this looks like sticky garlic down here. I'm going to deglaze it a little bit, I think. You could use wine. I'm just going to use a splash of vegetable stock that I happen to have already open in my fridge. Ooh, steamy. I don't know if you can see, hopefully, how vibrant this green is. Hopefully that comes through the camera and through your screen. And you can also probably notice the quantity is now a much more realistic amount. I'm going to turn off the heat and I'm going to transfer this to a bowl. And I'm going to move on to prep a couple onions. I just have sweet onions, also known as Vidalia onions. If you have a different kind of onion, you know, it'll be okay. Use what you have, but this is what I would recommend. So I turn my heat back on the lower side, adding some oil and my onions. To the onions, I am going to add a little more salt. Again, flavor every layer. And I have some fresh thyme from my garden. I'm going to add that in as well. You can take all the little leaves off. I find it's easier just to throw it all in, cook it up, and then pull the stems out later. If you don't have fresh thyme, you can add just the slightest little sprinkle of dried thyme. I find I'm not as big of a fan of the flavor of like the dried ground thyme. I mean, you can dry fresh thyme and have like the dried leaves. That tastes pretty good. But the ground thyme, just, I don't know. Honestly, it sort of tastes like dirt to me. So use it sparingly. I'm just stirring these around so they're nice and coated with the oil. I might even add just a little bit more oil. And I don't want my heat too high here. I want these to cook low and slow so they caramelize and become nice and sweet and delicious. I'm going to sort of leave them alone for a little bit and then come back to stir them in a few minutes. While my onions are cooking, I am going to sort of process my squash. Now, I could have done this ahead of time, but they were still a little bit warm, and they're still a little bit warm. They're probably, I don't want to burn myself while I'm doing this. So I had let them cool, and now I'm just folding up a paper towel just to have something to hold on to, just to protect my hands a little bit. And I'm just scooping all the good squash stuff out of my squash. So to the squash, a little salt, a little pepper, and then I'm going to mush it up a little bit. You could use a potato masher. You could use, I'm using a pastry blender. You could just use a fork and then mash it, you know, to whatever degree you like. I actually like to leave it a little chunky, so I just give it a light mash. and stir it around a little bit. Now see, this does feel a little bit dry to me. I'm imagining as I try to put this over or into my lasagna, spreading it out into a layer, that it's going to be hard to spread. You could add just a touch of water. You could add a little vegetable broth, which is what I'm going to do. You could also add maybe a little melted butter. Not a lot. We just want to loosen it up just a little bit. And then set it aside. Let's check the onions. They're cooking away. They smell delicious. I wish you could smell the combination of onions and thyme. It's really yummy. That's all I can say. See, I'm just looking around for anything that might be getting too brown to see if I need to turn my heat down a little bit. I could also add a splash of water or broth or wine if I thought it was, but it's looking pretty good. Again, my heat is sort of on low, medium. There is something here, but I think it's actually an onion peel. So we're good. I'm just going to let this continue to cook away. Checking on the onions again. They're cooking away. While the onions have been cooking, I have been busy picking up after myself. That is one of the hints I would give you. Making a dish like this that has several different recipes, several different steps, you go through a lot of dishes, and if you wait until the end, you're going to have just a sink full. So whenever I have a moment where I'm down waiting for something, like waiting for these to finish up, I clean up after myself. They don't have too much longer. They're getting fairly soft. I'm going to let them just go, maybe let them brown just a little bit more, and then we'll move on. All right, we're just about wanting to start to burn, but the onion is still looking good. So I'm going to pull it out and add it in with my kale. Trying to pull out my thyme. Oh, just I don't care if the leaves stay, I just want the stems out. And this pan is looking pretty yucky. So I'm going to clean it out before I make my bechamel sauce. I'm letting my soup pot soak for a few minutes to ease the scrubbing. And while that's soaking, I'm just prepping some of my ingredients for my bechamel sauce. The first one being some freshly grated Gruyere. You could substitute other cheeses here in the sauce if you wanted to. You just need something that melts really easy. I mean, I know this is going to be a little more on the expensive side. You have to buy it like at the cheese counter, not over in the dairy section. But it's worth it. Gruyere is great in mac and cheese because it melts so nice. It's also good in grilled cheese. So if you buy yourself a block of it and you only use a little bit for this lasagna, you can find uses for it. Now, I want about a cup. That looks like it's probably good. And then I'm going to need milk, flour, some red pepper flakes, some garlic, some bay leaves, and a little nutmeg, just for good measure. So my pan is clean, adding a little heat to the bottom, just a little bit of olive oil. I'm putting it right in the middle. And I have 2 baby cloves of garlic that I'm adding. So I don't want a lot of garlic, but I want a little bit because I want that little extra flavor. Letting that cook a little bit in the oil. Again, just a minute maybe. When you cook garlic, it makes it just a little less pungent. So the longer you cook it, or I should say like the earlier you put it in the recipe, the less pungent it will be. It becomes more of a background flavor versus an in-your-face flavor. So I like to start it first, get it softened up, and then let it flavor everything else rather than it being like that pop of flavor, which it would be if I added it at the end of making the sauce. Does that make sense? Okay, that is cooking away. I'm going to add in most of my milk. The recipe calls for 4 cups. I'm adding 3.5 here. Just stirring that around just to get the garlic and the oil all mixed in. And then I'm going to add in my bay leaves. You really only need 1. Why not 2? And then I'm just going to let this slowly warm up. Letting those bay leaves just steep in the milk as it warms. My milk is getting hot. It's nice and steamy. Stirring it around, starting to bubble a little bit. So I'm going to prep some of my other ingredients, getting them ready to put in the pot. What I've been looking at here is about 1/4 cup of flour and that other 1/2 cup of milk that I hadn't used. I'm just going to add them together, whisk them really well. And this becomes my thickening agent. Now, traditional bechamel, if you make it, you start it with several tablespoons of butter and then add the flour directly to the butter to make a roux, and then add your milk to that, and that is the roux becomes your thickening agent. I like this version because it doesn't use so much butter. I have just that little bit of olive oil. That was it. It still tastes great because you have all the cheese, you have salt, pepper, red pepper flakes, a little bit of nutmeg. So there's lots of other stuff, plus the bay leaves. Lots of other stuff flavoring it up. I feel like you don't really need the butter. It's just extra. It's just more than you need. So this, I just want to make sure all the lumps are out, that the flour is well blended. It is. So then I'm going to add it into my sauce. And now I'm just stirring this around. Eventually it will begin to thicken. But we also want to make sure that we cook it long enough because we want to make sure that that flour has time to cook. We don't want this to end up tasting like floury milk. That would be gross. So we're keeping the fire at probably about medium. It's still thickening, but while it's cooking away, heating through, I'm going to just add a few more seasonings. I'm going to add a good sprinkle of salt, and pepper together. Delicious. You could also use white pepper if you had that. I have red pepper flakes. Now, again, this isn't meant to be a spicy dish, but a little bit of heat just does really add to the flavor. I don't mind if I get a little bite of heat in mine. So you can skip this altogether if you want. You could also just use like a little pinch of cayenne if that's what you have, a pinch. Just use, I don't know, as much as you think you'll like. You know how much spice you can take. Like I can add this and I might not even notice it. Other people might add this much and be completely overspiced. The other thing I want to add is just a couple little grates of nutmeg. Not a lot. We don't want this to taste like a fall dessert. Just a little bit. It just adds this little depth of flavor that, I don't know, it's just good. But you can probably see that it's thickening up a little. I'm just going to keep stirring around. This is actually a very simple sauce when you think about what's in here, but it tastes so good. It's also a bit rich, so it's probably not a lasagna you're going to want to make every week. And this is definitely not a weeknight meal. This probably has taken me, by the time all said and done, it will probably be almost 2 hours from the time I started by roasting my squash to working through making the kale, the onions, prepping the squash, making the bechamel, and then assembly. This, to me, is a fancy lasagna, something you serve to company or you have for date night. All right, the sauce is looking thick. See how it's sticking to my spoon nice? So I'm going to see if I can find those bay leaves. That's the hard part now that you can't see. There's one. Somewhere in here is another one. It's like fishing. Oh, I just saw it. Where did you go? There we go. Got it. So the last thing I'm going to add in here is my Gruyere. Doesn't all want to come out. I'm going to turn my heat off. Let that melt in. And then I'm going to set this sauce aside for just a few minutes just to let it cool down a little bit before I go to assemble. Mostly just for my own safety. And there you go. And now it's time for assembly. So I'm going to start with just a drizzle of olive oil. You could also use, like spray oil. And then we're going to start with the sauce. So I'm going to take about a cup of sauce. Work that across the bottom. 2 sheets of these like oven ready pasta, lasagna noodles. If you don't have these and you have like the boiling noodles, just boil them and then add 1 layer of noodles. Then we're going to add about half of the squash. Now this might be more squash than we really need because I did 2 small, which is probably more than what like a medium squash would be. So I might use a little less than half. We'll see. We'll see how it feels. Just squishing it down, making a nice layer. The layer is probably, I don't know, 1/2 inch thick in some areas, thinner in others, probably thicker in others. Lasagnas are always pretty forgiving, which is one thing I love about them. So we have that. And then we're going to add about half of our kale mixture. Just sort of spread it out. And same really here. I mean, our measurements on this type of stuff, whether the squash or the kale, really rough. So just see how it feels. If you end up with a little leftover, you can add it into an omelet. That looks good. Now I have cheese. I just have shredded mozzarella cheese. I know you can shred your own. This probably has some, yeah, it's like cornstarch in it to keep it from sticking together. Not really the end of the world, but if you want to shred your own, you're more than welcome to. This is a 2-cup bag. I'm going to use about just maybe a little less than a third because I want a decent amount on top. And then I'm just going to repeat that. I'm going to maybe make my layers go a different direction this time. Press them down. Make sure it all mooshes together. Add a good cup of sauce. Just make sure I get it all over the noodles because the sauce is really what ends up cooking the noodles. You want to make sure that they're nice and covered in the sauce. And then we're back to the squash. Now this one is a little bit harder to layer in because we're going directly onto the sauce, so it feels, you know, a little mushier to try to get it in there. So I'm sort of scooping in smaller amounts. Just plain using your fingers. It's all right. My hands are clean. I feel like I have a nice layer of squash. Still have a little bit left again because, you know, measurements are kind of wonky. I'll find something to do with that. I'm going to come back to my kale. Some more cheese. And I invite you to check out my blog post where I do also offer a few variations of ways that you could change this up. Squish it down. And then we're just going to top it with a good cup of sauce. Ooh, that could have been bad. And we're going to end with the cheese. Now to cook this, we're going to sort of trying to talk while I'm moving aluminum foil is hard. I'm going to try to tent this a little bit. So I don't want the aluminum foil sitting right down on the cheese. I kind of want it to stay lifted a little bit. Easier said than done. We're going to bake it. We're going to bake it at 425 for about 40 minutes. See if it's getting done. Just make sure the noodles are nice and tender. And then we're going to finish it off by removing the aluminum foil, turning it up to broil, and just trying to get a little bit of darkness on the top. Just browning that cheese just a little bit. And then let it rest for a few minutes and serve. So I pulled this out of the oven about 10-15 minutes ago, letting it cool just a little bit. And then I'm serving it up. Add a little parsley, a little Parmesan, and voila, delicious.